The Forgotten Garden. The sun was low in the sky, painting the clouds in soft orange and pink. Amelia walked along the quiet road, her hands in her jacket pockets. The air smelled fresh, and the sound of birds filled the evening. She had just turned 21 a week ago and moved to this small town to start fresh. Everything felt slower here, calmer. She liked it. As she walked, she noticed a narrow path leading into the trees. It was overgrown with grass and wildflowers, almost hidden. She had walked this road many times before, but had never seen this path. Curious, she stopped. "Where does this go?" she wondered out loud. Amelia looked around. No one was nearby. The road was empty, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. She decided to follow the path. The path was quiet, and the trees formed a canopy above her, blocking out most of the sunlight. Amelia stepped carefully, brushing aside branches and stepping over roots. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. She noticed flowers growing along the edges of the path, bright yellow, soft purple, and deep red. They looked wild but beautiful, like they had been untouched for years. The air smelled sweet, like flowers after rain. As she walked, she saw something ahead. The path curved slightly, and there, hidden behind a wall of ivy, was a tall iron gate. The gate was old and rusted, with curling designs at the top. It looked like no one had touched it in a long time. The ivy around it was thick, and small purple flowers had grown between the leaves. Amelia stepped closer and placed her hand on the cool metal. She peered through the bars. Behind the gate, she saw something that made her heart skip. There was a garden. It was large, with winding paths, tall hedges, and plants of every kind. In the middle, she could just make out the shape of a stone fountain, though it wasn't working. The garden looked wild, like it had been forgotten. "What is this place?" she asked. Amelia pushed lightly on the gate. It didn't move. She pushed harder, and with a creak, it opened just enough for her to squeeze through. She stepped inside, her shoes crunching on the gravel path. The air felt cooler here, and the smell of flowers was stronger. She stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The garden felt different, like it was waiting for her. She couldn't explain why, but she felt like she wasn't supposed to be here, and yet she couldn't leave. She took a deep breath and decided to explore. Amelia stood at the entrance of the overgrown path, staring at the tall iron gate hidden behind the ivy. The rusted bars were covered in vines, and small purple flowers peeked out from the leaves. She wondered how something so large could stay hidden for so long. The gate looked heavy, but she wanted to see what was beyond it. She reached out and touched the cool metal. Her fingers brushed the ivy, and tiny leaves fell to the ground. Amelia gave the gate a small push, but it didn't move. She pushed harder, her shoulder pressing against it, and it creaked loudly. The sound echoed in the quiet air, making her pause. She glanced around as if someone might appear and scold her for trespassing, but the path was empty. Taking a deep breath, she gave the gate one last shove. It groaned and swung open just enough for her to step through. The garden inside was like something from a dream. The garden was large, surrounded by high stone walls covered in moss and ivy. The paths were made of gravel, though weeds and grass had grown over them in many places. Tall hedges lined the edges, their shapes wild and uneven. In the middle of the garden stood a stone fountain. It was dry and cracked, but its design was beautiful. The base was carved with twisting vines and tiny flowers, and a stone bird perched on top. Amelia walked closer, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The fountain seemed to watch her as she moved. She bent down and touched the edge, feeling the rough, cool surface of the stone. As Amelia stood by the fountain, she felt a strange sensation, like someone was nearby. She turned quickly, but the garden was silent. The hedges swayed slightly in the breeze, but there was no one there. Her heart raced for a moment, but she told herself it was nothing. She was alone in the garden, or so she thought. Amelia wandered down one of the overgrown paths, stepping carefully over tangled roots and broken stones. The plants here were unlike anything she had seen before. Some were familiar, like roses and daisies, though they grew wild and untamed. Others were strange, with twisting stems and bright, glowing flowers. One plant caught her attention. Its petals were a deep blue, and they shimmered in the sunlight as if covered in tiny crystals. She knelt down to look closer, but didn't touch it. Something about the plant felt important. As she continued walking, Amelia noticed a small wooden door built into the garden wall. The wood was old and cracked, with rusted hinges. A carved design on the door caught her eye. It looked like a flower, the same shape as the glowing blue one she had seen earlier. She reached for the handle, but it didn't budge. It was locked. Amelia frowned. Why would a door in a forgotten garden be locked? And why did the carving look so much like the strange flower she had just passed? Questions swirled in her mind, but she had no answers. Returning to the fountain, Amelia noticed something she hadn't seen before. One of the carved vines on the base looked different. Its shape was deeper, almost like it had been etched recently. She traced it with her finger and realized it pointed toward one of the paths. Amelia stood up and looked around. The path it pointed to was narrow, almost hidden by tall grass and wildflowers. Her curiosity grew. She decided to follow it. As Amelia walked down the hidden path, the air felt cooler. The sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by a deep silence. The path led her to a small stone bench surrounded by bushes. On the bench sat a statue of a bird, its wings spread as if ready to take flight. Underneath the statue, she saw something glinting in the sunlight. It was a small key. Amelia picked it up, turning it over in her hand. The metal was smooth and cold. She glanced at the locked wooden door in the garden wall. Could this key open it? She walked back toward the door, her steps careful on the overgrown gravel path. The wooden door was just as she left it, covered in moss, its hinges rusted. The carving of the flower seemed even more detailed up close, as if someone had carefully etched each petal long ago. She knelt down and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. With a soft turn, the lock clicked. Amelia pushed the door open slowly. It creaked loudly, the sound cutting through the silence of the garden. Behind the door was a small space, like a hidden corner of the garden. It was surrounded by tall hedges, and in the center stood a statue of a woman holding a large book. The statue was weathered, its edges soft and rounded from years of wind and rain. At the base of the statue, something shiny caught her eye. She crouched down and brushed away the leaves and dirt. It was a small plaque engraved with words, "To find the truth, look where the flowers bloom." Amelia frowned, reading the words again. What truth? And what did it mean by where the flowers bloom? Standing up, Amelia looked around the hidden space. There were flowers everywhere, roses, daisies, and others she didn't recognize. One group of flowers stood out. They were the same glowing blue flowers she had seen earlier. Their petals shimmered, even in the shade. She walked closer and noticed that the flowers formed a trail, leading back into the main garden. Her curiosity grew stronger. "I guess I follow these," she murmured. Amelia followed the trail of glowing blue flowers. They seemed to wind through the garden, leading her deeper into its overgrown paths. The farther she went, the quieter it became. She couldn't even hear the birds anymore. As she walked, she noticed more strange details. The trees here were larger, their branches twisting in unusual shapes. Moss covered almost everything, and the air felt cooler, almost damp. The trail of flowers led her to a small pond. The water was clear and its surface shimmered like glass. In the center of the pond was a small stone pedestal. On top of it was another statue, this one of a bird with its wings spread wide. Amelia knelt at the edge of the pond, her reflection staring back at her. The water was so still, it looked like a mirror. She could see tiny fish swimming near the surface, their scales catching the light. Her eyes drifted back to the pedestal in the center. Something about the statue felt important, but the water was too deep for her to reach it. She glanced around and saw an old wooden plank leaning against a tree. It looked sturdy enough to use as a bridge. She grabbed it and carefully placed it across the pond, balancing it on two large stones. Her heart raced as she stepped onto the plank. It wobbled slightly, but she kept her balance. When she reached the pedestal, she saw that the bird statue had something in its beak, a rolled-up piece of paper. Amelia carefully unrolled the paper. The edges were yellowed and fragile, but the writing was clear. The words read, "Begin where the light falls. The truth is hidden in the fountain's heart." She turned the note over, but there was nothing else written. She looked back toward the fountain in the middle of the garden. It had been dry and cracked when she first saw it, but now she wondered if it held more than it seemed. Amelia climbed off the pedestal and placed the plank back where she found it. She hurried back along the flower trail to the fountain. The garden felt different now, as if it was watching her. When she reached the fountain, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. At the very center of the basin was a small hole, just big enough to fit her hand. Taking a deep breath, she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. She pulled it out, a small metal key, shaped like a flower. "What does this unlock?" she wondered aloud. The garden gave her no answer, but she had a feeling her journey was just beginning. Amelia held the small flower-shaped key in her hand, turning it over carefully. It was light but cold to the touch, and its shape matched the carving she had seen on the wooden door earlier. But that door was already unlocked. What could this key open? She looked around the fountain again, hoping for another clue, but nothing stood out. The garden was quiet, the only sound coming from the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. She slipped the key into her pocket and decided to explore more. Her thoughts returned to the statue of the woman holding the book. There had been something about it that felt unfinished, like it was trying to tell her something. Amelia made her way back through the winding paths until she reached the hidden corner of the garden. The statue stood tall, covered in moss and shadows from the overhanging trees. Amelia stepped closer and looked at the book in the statue's hands. The pages were blank stone, but at the top was a shallow indentation, just big enough for the flower-shaped key. Amelia's heart skipped. This must be it, she thought. She pulled the key from her pocket and gently placed it into the slot on the book. It fit perfectly. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click, the book shifted slightly. The statue's hands moved, and the book opened wider, revealing a small compartment inside. Amelia reached in and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old and fragile, but the writing on it was still clear. It was a map. The map showed the garden from above, with paths, hedges, and landmarks drawn in careful detail. The fountain was at the center, and Amelia recognized the pond and the statue's corner. But there was something else, a mark near the farthest edge of the garden. It was labeled the heart. "What's the heart?" she wondered aloud. The fountain's note had mentioned the heart too. Is this where I need to go? Amelia studied the map carefully, tracing the paths with her finger. She tucked it into her pocket and turned back to the main garden. If the map was right, the heart was at the farthest point, behind a tall hedge. Amelia followed the map, taking turns through the garden she hadn't noticed before. The plants here were thicker, their leaves almost blocking the paths. Vines stretched across the ground, and she had to step carefully to avoid tripping. As she got closer to the marked spot on the map, the garden grew darker. The trees above were so thick that only small beams of sunlight broke through. The air felt cooler, and the silence was heavy, like the garden itself was holding its breath. She reached the tall hedge that the map had shown. At first, she thought it was solid, but when she looked closer, she saw a narrow opening, just wide enough for her to squeeze through. Amelia pushed through the hedge, the leaves brushing against her arms. On the other side, she stepped into a circular clearing. It was quiet and calm, like the rest of the garden didn't exist. In the center of the clearing stood another statue, smaller than the first. This statue showed a young girl holding a lantern. The base of the statue was covered in carvings of flowers and vines, and at its feet was a small box made of stone. The carvings on the box matched the flower shape on Amelia's key. Her hands shook slightly as she reached out. She turned the key in the lock, and the box opened with a soft click. Inside the box was another note, along with a small golden locket. Amelia picked up the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat but old, and it read, "To the one who finds this, you have reached the heart of the garden. The truth lies within the locket. Guard it well, for it holds the story of everything we left behind." Amelia stared at the locket in her hand. It was simple, with a small engraving of a flower on the front. She opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny faded picture of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. Behind the picture was a small piece of folded paper. Amelia unfolded the paper. It was another note, much shorter. "The truth of the garden is buried where the roots run deep. Look to the earth beneath the fountain." Her pulse quickened. She had been at the fountain earlier, but hadn't thought to look beneath it. She glanced back at the statue of the girl and the stone box, then at the locket in her hand. The garden wasn't just a place, it was a puzzle, and she was only beginning to understand it. Amelia tucked the locket and the notes into her jacket pocket, her mind racing. The fountain. She had been there earlier, but she hadn't looked closely at the ground beneath it. Could something really be buried there? She stepped back through the narrow opening in the hedge and onto the garden path. As she walked, the quiet air felt heavier. The garden seemed alive, as if it were watching her every move. The glow of the blue flowers nearby flickered slightly in the soft breeze. When Amelia reached the fountain, she stood still for a moment. The cracked stone structure looked the same as before, dry, weathered, and silent. But now she saw it differently. It was more than just an old decoration. It was part of the puzzle. She crouched down, running her hands over the base of the fountain. The carvings of vines and flowers seemed endless, each one detailed and precise. Then she noticed something, a small gap between two stones at the base. Amelia dug her fingers into the gap and pulled. The stone didn't move at first, but after a few tries, it slid free, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside the hollow space was a small wooden box. It was light and dusty, with tiny carvings of roses on the lid. Amelia carefully lifted it out and sat on the ground, brushing the dirt from its surface. The lid creaked as she opened it. Inside the box was a folded piece of paper and a single dried flower. The paper was yellowed with age, and the flower's petals were fragile, crumbling slightly when she touched them. She unfolded the paper slowly. The writing was blurry, but she could still read it. It said, "The garden's roots are deep. The truth is buried in the earth where the stones meet the stars." Amelia frowned. What does that mean? She wondered. She looked up at the fountain, then back at the box. The carvings on the box's lid matched the flower she had seen in the secret room. Everything seemed connected, but the message was unclear. Amelia decided to search the garden more carefully. She walked along the paths, stopping at every statue, bench, and patch of flowers. Each one seemed to hold something unique, an unusual carving, a symbol, or an engraving. Some matched the patterns she had already seen, while others were new. She made notes in her head as she moved, piecing together the clues like a puzzle. The glowing blue flowers, the carved symbols, the hidden notes. They all pointed to something deeper. As she wandered, Amelia found herself drawn to a large oak tree near the back of the garden. Its branches were thick and twisted, and its roots stretched far into the ground. At the base of the tree, she noticed something unusual, a patch of disturbed earth, as if someone had dug there before. Her heart raced as she knelt by the roots. She brushed the soil with her hands, uncovering a small stone slab hidden beneath the dirt. The slab was smooth, with more carvings etched into its surface. In the center of the slab was a small circle, just big enough to fit the locket. Amelia pulled the locket from her pocket and carefully placed it into the circle. It fit perfectly. As soon as it clicked into place, the stone slab shifted slightly, revealing another hidden compartment. Inside the compartment was a bundle wrapped in cloth. Amelia unwrapped it and found a small leather journal, its cover soft and worn. She opened it to the first page and read, "This garden holds our story. The truth is buried here, waiting to be found. Follow the flowers to uncover what was lost." Her hands trembled as she turned the pages. The journal was filled with notes, drawings, and letters, all written by the family who had once owned the garden. Each page seemed to tell a piece of their story, though much of it was faded and hard to read. Amelia sat by the tree, reading the journal. She learned that the family had built the garden as a place to hide something important, though it wasn't clear what. The notes mentioned a treasure, but they also spoke of a warning, something about protecting the garden's secret at all costs. The final entry was the most puzzling. It read, "The fountain is the key, but the garden is alive. Only those who listen will find the truth." Amelia closed the journal, her mind spinning. She looked around the garden, feeling both excited and uneasy. The more she uncovered, the more questions she had. What truth was the family trying to hide, and why did they leave the garden behind? Amelia sat beneath the old oak tree, the journal resting on her lap. The wind was soft, carrying the soft scent of the garden's flowers. She opened the journal again, flipping through the worn pages carefully. Each entry was written in neat handwriting, though some were faded and hard to read. The first pages were simple, describing the beauty of the garden and the joy it brought to the family who owned the manor. They spoke of planting flowers, carving statues, and creating a peaceful place for their family to gather. But as Amelia read further, the tone changed. The entries became darker, the words more urgent. One entry caught Amelia's attention. It was dated years after the earlier notes and written in a hurried hand. It read, "We have hidden the truth deep within the garden. It must remain safe. No one outside the family can know. The garden is alive now, watching, waiting. We must protect it at all costs." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine. The garden was alive? What did that mean? She looked around at the tangled plants and twisting trees. It felt quiet and still, but the words in the journal made her uneasy. As she read further, Amelia learned more about the family. The manor had once been a grand estate, full of life and laughter. The garden was their pride and joy, a place where they hosted gatherings and celebrated together. But something had changed. The journal mentioned a treasure that was too powerful to remain in the open. The family had decided to hide it in the garden, creating a series of clues and puzzles to ensure it would stay hidden. final entries hinted at a tragedy. The family had disappeared suddenly, leaving the manor abandoned. No one knew why or where they had gone. Amelia felt a growing sense of urgency. The journal hinted that the garden held more than just a treasure. It held answers about the family's disappearance. She flipped to the back of the journal and found a rough sketch of the garden. In the center of the sketch was the fountain, marked with a star. Around it were notes pointing to different parts of the garden: the statue of the woman, the glowing flowers, the oak tree, and something else. An arrow pointing to the farthest edge of the map, labeled the Gate of Roots. Amelia frowned. She hadn't seen anything like that yet. But if the journal was right, it was important. Amelia stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. She folded the journal carefully and slipped it into her pocket. The garden was quiet, almost too quiet, as she followed the map toward the edge of the garden. The path grew narrower, the plants thicker and darker. The sunlight barely reached this part of the garden, and the air felt cooler. Amelia pushed aside vines and ducked under low branches, her heart beating faster with every step. Finally she saw it, a stone archway covered in moss and ivy. The carvings on the arch were intricate, showing twisting roots and blooming flowers. At the center of the arch was a symbol she recognized, the same flower shape as the key she had found earlier. "This must be the Gate of Roots," she murmured. Amelia stepped closer, running her fingers over the carvings. The stone felt smooth and cold, and the flower symbol seemed to glow softly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the flower-shaped key. As she placed it into the center of the arch, the stone began to shift. The ground trembled slightly, and the archway opened, revealing a dark tunnel leading downward. Amelia hesitated, staring into the tunnel. The air coming from it was cool and smelled like earth and flowers. She gripped the journal tightly, taking a deep breath before stepping inside. The tunnel walls were made of stone, covered in moss and small roots that hung from the ceiling. The path sloped downward, and the light from the garden quickly faded. Amelia pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing softly in the narrow space. The walls were lined with carvings, symbols and patterns similar to the ones she had seen throughout the garden. Some of the symbols glowed softly, casting a dim light around her. At the end of the tunnel, she saw another stone door. This one was larger, with even more intricate carvings. At the center was another engraving of the flower. Amelia stepped closer, her heart racing. Whatever was behind this door, it was the heart of the garden. Amelia placed her hand on the door, feeling the rough surface of the carvings. She pushed gently, and the door creaked open, revealing a large underground chamber. The air inside was cool and still, and the soft glow of the carvings lit up the space. In the center of the chamber was a pedestal. On top of it was a small wooden box, similar to the one she had found earlier. Around the pedestal were more carvings, showing scenes of the family who had created the garden. Amelia approached the pedestal, her hands trembling. She reached for the box and opened it slowly. Inside was another journal, this one smaller but in better condition. She opened it and read the first page. "To the one who finds this, the truth of the garden lies here. Protect it, for it holds the story of what we lost." Amelia stood in the quiet underground chamber, holding the small journal in her hands. The glow from the carvings on the walls lit up the space with a soft light. She opened the journal again, turning the pages carefully. Each one told pieces of a story, written by someone from the family who once lived in the manor. The entries spoke of the treasure hidden in the garden. It wasn't gold or jewels, as Amelia had thought. It was something far more unusual, an object said to hold the family's memories and secrets. The journal described it as a glass orb, glowing with a light that changed colors. The entries warned that the orb was not just a keepsake. It was powerful, tied to the garden itself. The family had created the puzzles and hidden passages to protect it, fearing what might happen if it fell into the wrong hands. "The garden lives because of the orb," one entry read. "Without it, everything would wither, but the orb must never leave the garden or the balance will break." Amelia's hands shook as she read. She thought about the glowing flowers, the carvings, the strange feeling that the garden was alive. Was it all connected to this orb? Amelia looked around the chamber. The pedestal stood in the center, but the walls were covered in more carvings. One in particular caught her eye, a scene of a woman holding a glowing orb, standing beneath a large tree. As she approached the carving, she noticed a small handle carved into the wall beside it. She hesitated, then pulled it. The wall groaned and shifted, revealing a narrow tunnel leading deeper underground. The air that flowed from the tunnel was cooler, almost cold, and carried the soft scent of damp earth. Amelia hesitated for a moment, then turned on her phone's flashlight and stepped inside. The tunnel sloped downward, and the walls were lined with more glowing carvings. The light from them was dim but steady, casting strange patterns on the floor as Amelia walked. The air grew colder the farther she went, and the silence was so deep she could hear her own breathing. As she walked, she noticed more details. The carvings showed scenes of the family working in the garden, planting flowers, carving statues, and writing in journals. But as she moved deeper, the scenes changed. They showed storms, broken statues, and people leaving the garden. The last carving showed the garden overgrown, with no people in sight. Beneath it was a single word, "Remember." At the end of the tunnel, Amelia reached another stone door. This one was larger than the others, with a carving of the glowing orb at its center. The carvings around the door seemed to shift in the light, almost as if they were moving. Amelia placed her hand on the carving of the orb. The stone was cool under her fingers. Slowly she pushed, and the door swung open. The room beyond was unlike anything she had seen before. It was a circular chamber with walls covered in glowing vines. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on top of it sat the orb. The orb was about the size of a small bowl, and it glowed softly, shifting between shades of blue, green, and gold. The light filled the chamber, casting reflections on the walls. Amelia stepped closer to the pedestal, her heart pounding. The orb was beautiful, almost hypnotic. She reached out but stopped just short of touching it. The journal's warning echoed in her mind: the orb must never leave the garden. She knelt down and noticed something carved into the pedestal. It was another message. The garden's life is tied to the orb. To move it is to break the bond, but to leave it here is to protect its power. Amelia sat back on her heels, unsure of what to do. If the orb was so important, why had the family hidden it so deeply? What had they feared? And what would happen if the orb stayed here, untouched? As Amelia sat there, the room seemed to shift around her. The vines on the walls glowed brighter, and the air felt warmer. It was as if the garden itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her decision. She thought about the family, the notes they had left, and the puzzles they had created. They had gone to great lengths to protect the orb, leaving behind warnings and clues. Whatever the orb was, it was clear they had trusted the garden to keep it safe. Amelia stood and placed her hand gently on the orb. Its surface was smooth and warm, and the light inside swirled like liquid. She took a deep breath and whispered, "I'll leave you here." As soon as she stepped back, the orb glowed brighter, filling the room with golden light. The carvings on the walls shimmered, and the vines seemed to pulse with life. Amelia felt a wave of calm wash over her, as if the garden was thanking her. She turned and left the chamber, walking back through the tunnel. The glow of the carvings lit her path, and the air felt warmer now, less heavy. When she stepped back into the main part of the garden, the flowers seemed brighter, the leaves greener. Amelia stood in the garden, the cool breeze brushing her face. The air felt different now, lighter and more alive. The glowing blue flowers seemed to pulse gently as if breathing. The garden, which had once felt mysterious and heavy, now felt welcoming. But there was still one question in her mind. Why had the family left the garden behind? She pulled the small leather journal from her pocket and opened it again. The last entry mentioned the garden's connection to the family and something called the Great Departure. Amelia frowned as she read the words. What had happened to make the family abandon such a beautiful place? Amelia flipped through the journal, searching for more answers. Toward the back, she found a page filled with hurried writing. The handwriting was shakier than in earlier entries, as though written in fear or haste. The garden is alive, but its power grows stronger. We built this place to protect the orb and the balance it holds, but we fear we have awakened something we cannot control. The storms have grown worse, the roots grow deeper, the garden whispers to us now. Amelia shivered as she read. She glanced around the garden, her eyes lingering on the statues, the glowing flowers, and the overgrown paths. The idea of the garden whispering sent a chill through her, but she reminded herself of how calm and beautiful it felt now. The final words on the page were underlined, "To save the garden, we must leave. It is the only way." The journal mentioned one last clue, a hidden room in the manor itself. Amelia hadn't thought much about the old building that bordered the garden, but now her curiosity burned. What else had the family left behind? And what was the true story of the garden's creation? She closed the journal and looked toward the crumbling manor. Vines climbed its stone walls, and the windows were dark and empty. She hadn't dared explore it before, but now she felt she had no choice. Amelia walked toward the house, her steps crunching on the gravel path. The front door was slightly ajar, the wood warped from years of rain and neglect. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The air inside was still and cool, carrying the soft smell of damp wood. Dust coated every surface, and the floor creaked beneath her feet. Sunlight streamed through broken windows, casting long shadows across the room. Amelia walked slowly, her eyes scanning the walls and furniture. The house was full of forgotten objects, chairs covered in sheets, books stacked on dusty tables, and faded portraits hanging crookedly on the walls. She stopped in front of one of the portraits. It showed a man and woman standing with a young girl. They looked proud but tired, their faces serious. Amelia wondered if they were the family who had built the garden. Her eyes drifted to a small brass key hanging on a hook beneath the portrait. She took it, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The journal had mentioned a locked room at the back of the house. Maybe this was the key. Amelia moved through the house, the floorboards groaning softly under her steps. At the end of a narrow hallway, she found a heavy wooden door. The carvings on its surface were familiar, flowers, vines, and the same swirling patterns she had seen in the garden. She inserted the brass key into the lock and turned it. The door opened with a soft creak, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves filled with books, papers, and strange objects. In the center of the room was a desk. On it sat a single book, its leather cover embossed with a golden flower. Amelia stepped closer and opened it. The book was a record of the family's connection to the garden. It described how the garden was created, how the orb was discovered, and how the family had dedicated their lives to protecting it. One passage caught Amelia's attention. The orb is not of this world. We do not know where it came from, but it holds great power. We believed we could use it to create beauty and balance, but the garden has grown beyond our control. It is alive, and it is watching. We cannot stay. Another entry described the family's departure. We left the garden to protect it. We could no longer remain without disturbing its balance. The garden belongs to the orb now, and it will guard its own secrets. Amelia closed the book slowly. The garden wasn't just a place. It was something alive, something connected to the orb in a way no one fully understood. The family hadn't abandoned it out of neglect. They had left because they believed it was the only way to keep the garden safe. Amelia stepped back into the garden, the book still in her hands. She felt a deep sense of awe and respect for the place. The family had created something extraordinary, something they couldn't fully control, but had loved enough to protect. The glowing flowers seemed brighter now, their soft light pulsing gently. The garden felt calm and peaceful, as if it was welcoming her presence. She sat by the fountain, placing the book carefully on the stone edge. She ran her fingers over the carvings, feeling a sense of connection to the place she hadn't felt before. She glanced around at the glowing flowers, the twisting trees, and the moss-covered statues. The garden felt alive in a way she couldn't fully explain. She thought about the family who had left this place. They had given up their home and their lives here to protect something they believed was greater than themselves. Amelia felt honored to have uncovered their story, but a part of her wondered if there was more to the garden than even they had understood. As she stepped back, the air around her seemed to shift. The flowers glowed a little brighter, and the soft scent of blossoms filled the air. Amelia smiled. It was as if the garden was thanking her for returning the book. Amelia decided to take one last walk through the garden. She followed the winding paths, her fingers brushing against the leaves and petals as she passed. The glowing flowers seemed to sway gently, though there was no wind. She paused by the statue of the woman holding the book. The small compartment was still open, revealing the empty space where the map had been. Amelia smiled, remembering how the map had led her to the heart of the garden. At the old oak tree, she knelt by its roots, where she had found the stone slab. The carvings on the slab seemed softer now, their edges blurred by time. She touched the cool surface and whispered, "Thank you." Amelia made her way back to the Gate of Roots, the stone archway she had discovered earlier. The carvings on the arch were glowing softly, their light soft and steady. She placed her hand on the cool stone, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. She didn't need to go back into the underground chamber. The orb was safe, and the garden was alive. She knew now that it wasn't her job to take anything or to change the garden. Her role had been to understand its story and to honor the family who had created it. As Amelia stepped back through the archway, she noticed something lying on the path. It was a single glowing blue flower, its petals shimmering in the soft light. She picked it up carefully, cradling it in her hands. The flower felt warm, its light steady and comforting. Amelia smiled. The garden had given her a gift, a piece of itself to take with her. Amelia walked back toward the iron gate where her journey had begun. The garden felt quieter now, as if it were settling into a deep, peaceful rest. She paused at the gate and turned to look back one last time. The fountain stood in the center, its carvings glowing softly in the dim light. The statues, the flowers, and the paths all seemed to blend together, forming a place that felt timeless and alive. "Thank you," Amelia whispered. She didn't know if the garden could hear her, but she felt it in her heart. She pushed the gate open and stepped back onto the overgrown path. As Amelia walked back toward the quiet road, she held the glowing flower tightly in her hand. She didn't know what the future held, but she felt different now, calmer, more connected to something greater than herself. The garden's secrets were safe, and its story would live on in her memory. The blue flower's gentle light guided her steps as the sun began to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. The forgotten garden had shared its story with her, and now it would rest again, hidden and waiting for another curious soul to discover it someday.